Hello everyone, my name is Y2BlockC and I was level designer on Time Watch for Team 12 for the first two levels of the game, the forest section and the mine section, in which I introduced movement mechanic, interaction mechanic and shooting mechanic to the player. When the player drops into the level, the first thing that he is advised to do is to use WSD to move, and is given a free and safe space to try it out. And the moment he tries to progress, the first thing that is suggested is to use spacebar to jump, while also using the lighting to try to guide the vision of the player towards the hints. The challenge will be really simple and almost impossible to fail, as just pressing jump once in front of the ledge will make the player go up. Now, once the player exits the cave, the first thing that he sees is the golden light on the top at the entrance of the mine, framed by the trees on the left and the right. So the hope is to establish the goal really early on. Also, you will notice how from this moment onwards the player will always go up until he gets to the mine. Now, as you can see here, there are two paths. The reasoning behind this choice was to enhance exploration since the very start. Both ways offer the same type of challenge to the player. That is a jumping validation challenge. In this case, the player can jump over the logs, while on the secondary route, he's gonna have to jump over the rock. Now, of course, if the player chooses to go through the hidden route, he will be rewarded with one of the collectibles scattered through the level that will hopefully spark his interest for further exploration later on. Now, as you can see, at the bottom of the screen there is a hint suggesting the player to sprint, and if you will do so in the group of birds, they will fly away in the direction of the monster. If the player decides to follow them with his camera, he will be reminded once more of what his objective is. The next challenge is instead a jumping intermediate challenge. The player is reminded of what he just achieved by a challenge that is just similar to the previous one, but then is faced with a new problem, a longer jump. As you can see, there is a hint that suggests the player that the distance is too great to just jump across it. If the player will try so, he will fail without getting any punishment. But every time he will fail, he will be suggested to try to combine sprinting and jumping together to overcome this challenge. If the player will do so, the jump should be easily achievable and he will get to the other side. Now, as you can see here, we have the introduction of a new element that will be brought back later on in the game, that is the minecart. If the player decides to do so, he can play around with it in this safe space without having any consequences of his act and just experiment with it. More than a minecart ride, we have a final jumping challenge here. As you can see, the distance is this time greater and the landing spot is actually higher, so the player will not only be forced to use sprinting combined with jumping, but also to have really precise timing and direction. And if he will fail, he will be this time punished by fall damage, introducing him to this mechanic of the game. If the player succeeds, he can get to the other side of the gap and continue onward. Also notice the minecart rail that will be guiding the player from this moment onwards in the game. Once we get to the top of this slope, the player is giving a slingshot. A new HUD element appears on screen and the player is suggested to click left mouse button to shoot. Once the player does so, he will notice how weak the shot is and he will be advised to hold the left mouse button instead to charge up his shot. This will finally allow him to kill the spider if he will to do so. Once the player is done, he can move on to the next section, but not before validating his use of the mechanic by shooting a spider that is on its way. In this new section instead, we are left building the shooting mechanic. The player has learned to shoot, to charge his shot, and that shooting elements of the environment will cause a reaction. Now in this case is faced with the gap once more, but if he will try to jump, he will notice that the distance is way too big to be overcome with just a jump. On top of his head, the player can see a structure holding some rocks, and the beams that were supporting the structure are broken down into pieces in the gap that is under him. And the beam is a massive rock of the same color of the one on top of the structure that is already placed almost as a step next to the other end of the gap. Finally, if the player focuses his attention on the beam, he will notice that there is a spider on it. This is an extra hint I placed there to make sure that the players do not struggle too much to understand what next step to do it. If the player will shoot the beam, or the spider, the structure will collapse, releasing the rocks and creating a path that the player can use to jump across the gap. Once this section is completed, the player is rewarded by the vista and the overview of what he just achieved. If you continue onwards, the player will be introduced now to a new mechanic, that is interaction. If the player gets close to the lift that is in front of him, a message will get prompted inviting him to press E to interact with the door. If the player will do so, the door will open. The player is naturally invited to jump onto the lift and to press the big red button that is inside it. But if he will do so, nothing will happen, and a sound effect will give reinforcement to the fact that the button is not operating. If the player looks around, he will be able to see a cable connected to the button, and if you will follow that cable, you will find a generator that will be once more as a validation interactable with E and will give both visual and audio feedback of the fact that something positive. If the player will now go back to the button and press it while standing in the lift will go up and the player will be able to proceed to the next section. At this point, the player is now at the entrance of the mine. You will notice how from this moment onwards the space will get more and more enclosed and claustrophobic, the atmosphere much darker, and the player will be constantly going down. And this is going to be the first challenge the player is faced with in the mine. As you can see, there is a hint that suggests that there is a way to turn the lights on. So this way the player can interact with the generator and get reminded of the interaction mechanic plus the buttons themselves. And here, as you can see, there was a hint to the fact that there must be a way to activate the generator on the other side. The player analyzes the situation and understands that there is no way to jump across it. Now here the intention is to left field the interaction mechanics as much as the shooting and hope that the player is able to do the mental leap required to understand that the key to solve this problem is to shoot the button on the generator. Once on the other side, scripted cover event triggers, showing that the way back is blocked and giving new motivation to the player and changing the motivation of exploration into the motivation of survival. Now this is the second puzzle the player is faced with. As you can see, there is one generator switching the bridges asynchronously and another one on the other side. So this is the left field validation where the player has to use the mechanic he just learned to get across safely. On the other side, we have a variation of the same challenge. As you can see here, there is some kind of device together with a button on the other side. If the player pushes the button, gets negative feedback and a hint to the fact that this is a counterweight system. If he looks around, you can see that one platform is up while the other one is down, and a rock is next to the first one. So the hope is that the player is going to touch the rock, see that it is a physics object, and playing around with it is going to end up pushing the rock down the lift, noticing that one goes down and the other one goes up. So now, to solve the puzzle, the player is required to push the minecart into the other lift, but as you can see, the rail brings to the end of the line. So what the player is required to do is to shoot at the red switch, make sure that the rail changes direction and that he is able to push the rocks into the counter lift, so then he can reach the second lift safely. The rail switch itself was introduced because the original plan was to have a minecart right after this section where the player would use timing skills and aiming skills to switch the rails at the right time and not flying into the void. This is instead the last challenge for this section. As you can see, if the player looks around, can have the fair chance of noticing the boulders before him, and is introduced with a new type of switch, that is a lever, that cannot be interacted with if shooting. Now the player just have to press E to interact to lose control of the camera. Scripted camera then fires off, and now the player has control again and can challenge himself with the boulder run. This serves as a mastery validation of all the movement skills that he just learned. When the boulder run is completed, the player can progress towards the next area. As you can see, here is one new element is introduced, that is this pulsating purple crystal that will be main focus for the next sections. Here it is. This is our vista, and as you can see, this is still work in progress. But here there is going to be the connection to Thomas's section that will then join back to Fabian's section and to the introduction of the time freeze again down here. And now back to Fabian.